A few weeks ago, Prager University published a video that praised one of the most murderous empires in world history, the British Empire. Now I say this as a descendant of English colonists who settled in Australia between 1850 and 1900, only a few decades after the British had successfully subdued the indigenous population. Now, one of the main arguments of this Prager Uni video is that the British saw themselves as liberators, when in reality they saw themselves as conquerors who had the right to rule over so-called inferior races. Anyway, let's begin.
Over the last 400 years, what power has done the most to spread the ideals of limited government, an independent judiciary, certain inalienable rights, and free markets? That power would be the British Empire.
Complete rubbish. The biggest idea that the British ever spread was the idea of white supremacy. That is why they horribly mistreated Indians, Australian Aborigines, and other people who lived under their iron grip. As for an independent judiciary, you can just see the conduct of the British-controlled courts in India to debunk that lie. For example, an English citizen who murdered one of his Indian servants was sentenced to only 6 months in prison, and only had to pay a small fine. However, an Indian who attempted to rape an English woman was sentenced to 20 years in prison. That does not sound like an independent judiciary to me. The narrator goes on to say that the British Empire promoted limited government, a claim that isn't even worth a response. If you think that a global empire that relied on an extensive bureaucracy and state-led repression promoted small government, then you are simply an idiot who has no business talking about history or politics.
Freedom was an Englishman's right, and wherever he went, he took that right with him, whether he was an English colonist in America, governing himself through a locally elected assembly, or an English adventurer like Sir Stamford Raffles, creating the free market city-state of Singapore, or an English officer like T.E. Lawrence, leading Arab tribesmen against the Turks. The British always thought of themselves as liberators, as bringers of freedom.
Notice how that absurd and racist interpretation of history completely ignores the views of the conquered Indians, Asians, Africans, and indigenous Australians. Instead, the narrator chooses to talk about colonizers and invaders, who are all of British descent. This is because he knows that the British treated the natives in a very cruel and brutal manner. As for the nonsense about the British viewing themselves as liberators, completely untrue. The British authorities saw their colonies as cash cows and symbols of British power, caring very little about the native people. The most striking example of this was how the British treated indigenous Australians. They not only led military campaigns to wipe them out, they also claimed that Australia was unoccupied when they arrived. Indeed, such was their attitude that the descendants of the British occupiers declared Australia to be an outpost of the British race in Asia, completely ignoring the indigenous people of the country. This would have pleased Cecil Rhodes, Winston Churchill, and other British imperialists who saw the Anglo-Saxon race as superior to all others.
Believed the final and necessary justification of their empire was a moral one. The British kept the peace. They brought sound, honest administration. And they insisted that basic moral standards were honored. The British did not try to nation build in the way we think of it now. They were under no illusions about making Arabs or Afghans or Zulus into Englishmen. They were more than content to leave people alone, to let them be themselves, to govern them with the lightest possible hand.
This interpretation of history is a racist one. The British were not there to keep the peace, nor did they largely leave the natives alone. They were there to rule over them and were willing to use brutal force to subdue the native population. In all cases, the British met with fierce resistance, especially in Zululand.
We remember this when we think of the British Empire's so-called benign neglect. We can see it throughout the history of the British Empire. Think about the vast territory of the Sudan. It was governed by 140 British civil servants.
This paints a misleading picture. The Sudan was ruled by both the British and the Egyptians, with the Egyptians taking most of the positions in the civil service. However, The Egyptians ultimately answered to the British Governor-General of the region, who ruled the Sudan basically as a dictator.
Even Gandhi praised the British Empire, paraphrasing Jefferson, saying that he believed that the best government was the government that governed least, and that he found that the British Empire guaranteed his freedom and governed him least of all.
Gandhi did say this, but only in 1915, where he was a supporter of Britain's role in the First World War. However, by the 1930s, his views had radically changed. He claimed that the British Empire had engaged in exploitation and were oppressors. He even led the Quit India campaign in 1942, which led to him and his colleagues being imprisoned without trial by British authorities. So in the last decades of his life, Gandhi was an enemy of the British Empire.
No power did more to abolish slavery and the slave trade in the modern world than did the British Empire. The British Treasury spent enormous sums to liberate slaves and compensate slave owners in the Caribbean. The Royal Navy had as a primary duty the eradication of the slave trade, and in fact abolishing the slave trade became a major factor driving the expansion of the British Empire. The British enforced a Pax Britannica, putting down pirates, taming headhunters, and keeping the peace between previously warring tribes and religions.
Now the narrator is claiming that the driving force of British imperial expansion was the abolishment of slavery. This is a load of rubbish because the British economic system was based on economic exploitation of cheap labour. That is why, after they abolished slavery, they quickly started to promote indentured labour, which was sometimes just as bad.
Indentured immigration is one of the most remarkable episodes in modern history. The systematic recruitment and migration of over 1 million people to all the corners of the globe. Indians are one of the most dispersed groups on this planet. And have you ever stopped to think why Indians are found in these far-flung places?
For hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children, this was not just a voyage into the unknown. It was a life sentence.
When you take the system of coercion, the system of the lack of justice, the meagerness of people's existence, and the fact that they were just there to work, to make money for the planter class, then you can see why indentureship was called a new system of slavery.
While respecting and often ruling through local leaders, the British still insisted on certain Judeo-Christian moral standards. They were not, in that respect, multiculturalists. They had a firm sense of right and wrong. When Sir Charles Napier was confronted by the practice of suttee, widow burning, in India, he told the Brahmin priests involved that he understood it was their custom. But the British had a custom too. They hanged men who burned women alive, and their goods were confiscated. So if the Brahmins insisted on continuing their tradition of widow burning, then he would insist on following his British tradition of hanging the murderers of widows. Widow burning in India soon ceased.
The underlying argument seems to be that the British were civilizing the savages. The truth is that the practice of burning widows had already been largely abolished, even before the British arrived in India in 1707. Yes, it still continued on a limited scale, and the British later fought against the practice, but it should be made clear that the Indians had largely abolished the practice before the British arrived.
Deadliest threats to freedom in the 20th century, we generally think of communism and Nazism. But how many remember that in 1940, after the Hitler-Stalin Pact and after the fall of France, one power, the British Empire, stood alone in mortal combat against the combined tyrannies of the world?
First of all, Britain signed more pacts with Hitler than the Soviets did. Secondly, the British were never at war with the Soviets, so you are talking nonsense again. Another point that should be made is that Hitler was in fact a great admirer of the British Empire, and even boasted that Russia would be the Third Reich's India.
Even where the British have merited criticism, as in Ireland, there is more to the imperial story. During negotiations to create the Irish Republic, for instance, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who could speak Welsh, reminded the Irish nationalist and Gaelic extremist Eamon de Valera that the Celts never had a word for republic. It was an idea given to them by the English.
That just seems to be a snide remark at the expense of the Irish, nothing to be proud about. The narrator concludes by claiming that the British Empire was a great and liberty-loving empire, which is a joke. The British Empire murdered tens of millions through forced famines, repression, and economic exploitation. It was not a great empire, but an evil one.